In a time when we rely on freezers, packaged foods, and expiration dates printed on everything, it's easy to forget that not so long ago, people preserved food without any of it. Amish grandmothers, living without electricity or modern appliances, mastered natural ways to keep food fresh through every season. They didn't use plastic wrap or artificial preservatives. They used root cellars dug deep into the ground, large wooden barrels filled with brine, layers of salt, beeswax-coated cloth, and the wisdom passed down through generations. These methods weren't based on trends or survival shows. They were part of everyday life, built around respect for the land, patience, and using every resource to its fullest. In this video, we're taking a closer look at these forgotten techniques. Practical, time-tested, and surprisingly effective even today. This is more than just a look back at old traditions. It's a reminder that nature has always had the answers. We just stopped listening. Number 1. Cooling without ice. Before refrigeration ever existed, Amish grandmothers were already relying on clever, reliable methods to keep food cool. Their most trusted solution was the spring house, a simple stone-built structure constructed directly over a running stream or spring. But don't mistake it for just a shed. These spring houses were carefully designed, placed where the water ran coldest, shielded from direct sunlight, and built low into the earth to trap cool air. The stone walls held in the chill, and the continuous flow of water ensured that temperature inside remained stable, even during hot summer days. Inside, large earthenware crocks filled with fresh milk, churned butter, or soft cheeses were partially submerged in the stream. No lids needed. The water kept everything at just the right temperature to prevent spoilage, and the movement of the stream kept insects and bacteria from settling. But cooling didn't stop there. Amish homes were full of quiet strategies. In the heat of summer, shaded porches became natural pantries. Items like bread, cooked vegetables, or sealed jars were placed in baskets covered with cloth and left in the cooler air. Under beds and behind thick curtains, food could be kept from direct light and heat, making every inch of the house useful. Root cellars were another staple, a space dug deep into the ground, often with stone walls and a wooden door, where cool, moist air made the perfect environment for storing everything from carrots and cabbage to butter wrapped in cloth. In colder months, the approach changed. Amish families took full advantage of the natural freezer outside. Meats were stored in wooden boxes or barrels lined with thick straw, sawdust, or even dried leaves. These containers were often placed in shaded corners of barns, beneath porches, or inside unheated sheds. Once temperatures dropped below freezing, the meat stayed solid for weeks without ever needing artificial cooling. And unlike our frozen goods today, the Amish would rotate and inspect what they stored constantly. Nothing was left to chance. What set these women apart was their awareness. They didn't just store and forget. They paid attention daily, checking the firmness of butter, the smell of milk, or the weight of a wrapped roast. Their senses were their tools. They felt condensation on the walls. They watched for frost. They knew when food was changing before it showed any signs. For them, cooling food wasn't just a process. It was a practiced discipline, shaped by experience and rooted in respect for the land and the seasons. Number 2. Zero-waste survival tactics. In the heart of every Amish kitchen, waste simply didn't exist. Every peel, pit, shell, and scrap had a second life waiting. There was no such thing as throwing food away just because it wasn't perfect, or because it didn't look appealing. Amish grandmothers approached food with deep intention. Everything brought into the home was expected to serve its full purpose, from root to tip, from bone to broth, from liquid to ash. It wasn't about being overly thrifty. It was a natural way of life, grounded in respect for the effort it took to grow, raise, or harvest each ingredient. Take vegetables, for example. The water used to boil potatoes or carrots never went down the drain. It was rich with nutrients and flavor, and by the next morning, it became the base for a soup or stew. If onions or herbs had been boiled with it, even better. That broth was a head start on tomorrow's meal. Fruit scraps were gold. Apple cores and peels were packed into glass jars, covered with water and sugar, and left to ferment into apple cider vinegar. Peach pits were simmered gently to extract subtle almond flavor for jellies and preserves. Even corn cobs were used to infuse chowders or boiled down to create naturally sweet syrups. Bread, once it began to harden, was never wasted. Amish women grated stale loaves into fine crumbs, dried them further in low ovens, and saved them in tin containers for breading meat or thickening sauces. Even sour milk had a role to play. Instead of tossing it, they used it to make cottage cheese or let it sour further to bake tender cakes and biscuits. The natural acidity replaced commercial buttermilk and added a distinct richness that couldn't be replicated. Then there were the parts most modern households wouldn't dream of saving. Chicken wasn't just meat, it was a full cycle. Once cooked, the skin was rendered into fat for frying. The bones went into a pot for broth. Any small scraps were chopped and added to stuffing or hash. Nothing edible went to waste. And beyond the plate, even ashes from the wood-burning stove were collected and used to polish cookware or enrich garden soil. This wasn't a trend. It wasn't a sustainability challenge. For Amish grandmothers, it was simply the way things were done. Every part had a purpose, and every purpose had a place in the rhythm of home life. They didn't talk about zero waste. They lived it, quietly, efficiently, and with a kind of reverence that modern culture is only now beginning to understand. Number 3, cloth, wax, and nature's wraps. In an Amish kitchen where practicality meets tradition, plastic had no place. Instead, preservation relied on a deep understanding of natural materials, things that breathed, protected, and lasted. Amish grandmothers didn't reach for synthetic wrap or disposable containers. They turned to cloth, beeswax, leaves, and fiber straight from their gardens or pantries. This wasn't done for aesthetics or ideology. It was a method honed through generations, where each wrap, tie, or seal had a reason behind it, and nothing was ever used just once without thought. Muslin cloth was one of the most trusted tools. It was always clean, often soaked in vinegar before use to create a mildly acidic layer that protected soft cheeses from spoilage. The cloth absorbed excess moisture while allowing airflow, which meant the cheese didn't sweat or mold too quickly. When more durability was needed, the same muslin was coated in beeswax. Grandmothers would warm natural beeswax between their hands, then rub it directly onto the fabric, softening it further with a heated iron. The result was a semi-stiff, reusable wrap that clung gently to bread loaves, blocks of butter, or even leftover pie. This homemade waxed cloth offered natural antibacterial properties, gave off a faint honey scent, and created a seal that was breathable enough to prevent condensation but secure enough to keep food fresh longer. Large outer cabbage leaves were used in ways most people today wouldn't imagine. They lined baskets that held root vegetables, acting as a moisture buffer. Sometimes they covered open crocks of fermenting vegetables where their shape and flexibility made them a perfect natural lid. Grape leaves played a different role. Laid gently over jars of pickles before sealing, they helped retain crispness thanks to their tannins. Corn husks, after drying, were softened with steam and wrapped around herbs for drying or to tie bundles of greens, destined for the smokehouse or root cellar. Even when it came to sealing jars, grandmothers used what they had. Before commercial lids were common, they relied on parchment paper or thick fabric, tied tightly with cotton twine, and dipped into melted wax to create an airtight seal. It wasn't rushed or careless. Every layer was done with intention, ensuring the food underneath was protected from dust, insects, or air exposure. In their world, every material had a job, and every wrap had a story. These weren't temporary fixes. They were long-term solutions rooted in resourcefulness and respect. Wrappings weren't just for storage. They were part of the preservation process itself, enhancing the flavor, prolonging shelf life, and reducing waste all at once. Number 4, barrel pickling and dry salt layers. In Amish communities, especially within larger families where food needed to last through long winters, preserving in small glass jars was never enough. That's where the age-old tradition of barrel pickling came into full force. These weren't decorative containers. They were full-sized wooden barrels, often between 10 and 20 gallons, made of oak or chestnut, and sealed tightly with handmade lids. Each barrel had its own identity. Some were reserved for sour pickles, others for green beans, shredded cabbage, onions, or a mixed vegetable medley known in some homes as winter relish. Every vegetable placed inside was washed, trimmed, and packed with care, then fully submerged in a heavily salted brine that had to be just right. Not too strong to kill off flavor, not too weak to risk spoilage. These barrels were placed in the coolest corners of pantries or basements, where the temperature remained steady and the light stayed low. That darkness wasn't for convenience, it was intentional. Exposure to light and heat could destabilize the fermentation, causing off flavors or unwanted bacterial growth. And while many imagine pickling to be a passive process, Amish grandmothers were anything but hands-off. They regularly lifted the barrel lids to check on the brine. If it looked cloudy or developed scum on top, they would skim it clean with a wooden ladle. If the pickles started tasting too sharp too fast, they knew how to draw back the acidity by adding just a touch of clean water or adjusting salt levels. This was preservation guided not by strict recipes, but by intuition, smell, texture, and constant interaction. Alongside the barrel work was another powerful preservation method, dry salt layering. This was especially used for meat cuts, shredded cabbage, or even thick slices of root vegetables. Unlike brining, this method used no water. Instead, salt was used in its pure form to draw out moisture and create an environment where bacteria couldn't thrive. A thick wooden box or ceramic crock was filled layer by layer. First came a clean handful of coarse salt, then a layer of meat or vegetable, then another thick coating of salt, and so on. Over time, the salt would harden around the food, creating a protective crust. The food inside wasn't spoiled, it was simply resting in a natural seal, waiting to be soaked or rinsed before cooking. Amish women could tell just by pressing a finger to the salt how deep the curing had gone. These methods weren't about tradition for tradition's sake, they worked. Without relying on electricity, preservatives, or modern tools, these women created entire winter pantries full of ready-to-use ingredients, all from barrels, salt, cold air, and a knowledge passed down with practiced, deliberate hands.